Hi, this is Ed Driscoll. Welcome to Silicon Graffiti. I'm talking today with Stephen Hayward at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the author of Volume 1 of The Age of Reagan, which was released in 2001, and Volume 2, which was released just this month. And Steve, thanks for stopping by Silicon Graffiti.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
Steve, it's been 8 years since the first volume of The Age of Reagan. What took the second volume so long to complete?
Well, a lot of distractions in my other parts of my professional life. I do an awful lot of work on environmental issues, and for better or worse, the last few years I've been dragged into the whole climate change black hole. And that's taken a lot more of my time. And I did write a couple of other books along the way that were spin-offs from my Reagan project.
During your appearance at the Ashbrook Center in November of 2001, you said that the first volume of The Age of Reagan could be summed up in 2 sentences.
Well, the premise of my book is that Franklin Roosevelt was, I think, obviously the most consequential president of the first half of the 20th century, and Ronald Reagan is shaping up to have been the most consequential president of the second half of the 20th century. And so his story deserves to be told in a style and in a scope commensurate with all the great books that were written about Roosevelt and the New Deal, most especially Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s multi-volume Age of Roosevelt. It's time, I thought, for someone to return the favor and do The Age of Reagan. And although Professor Benz refers to the heft of the book, I think it's possible to summarize the argument and action of the book in about 2 sentences. This book seeks to explain why Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, and not merely how. The thesis of the book, as it ends in 1980 with his election, is that Reagan was the right man for the moment. But the coming of that moment needs to be explained. It needs to be explained in some length, I think, and in some detail.
Steve, how would you sum up the second, similarly thick volume?
The second volume, above all else, tries to explain the unity of Reagan's statecraft. Now, the background of that is pretty simple. In recent years, there's grown up this view, especially among Reagan's liberal admirers, and he has some liberal admirers. They divide him up into 2 halves, into his foreign policy and Cold War story, which they mostly approve of, and domestic policy, which they tend to disapprove of, the liberals do. And I argue that you cannot understand Reagan that way, that there was a unifying theme to his foreign policy and his domestic policy. And that unifying theme, which he actually gave in one sentence himself now and then, is that there's a threat to liberty that comes both from totalitarian governments and also from big government and bureaucracy as we experience it.
Numerous conservatives have noted that the air traffic controllers strike early in the president's first term was a turning point for Reagan and how he was perceived. Could you talk a bit about that incident?
Right. Well, the firing of the air traffic controllers proved, as Newt Gingrich put it, that Ronald Reagan was not a college president. That's what the Union thought he was going to be, that he could be rolled. That was a difficult decision for the Reagan administration. There was genuine fear that if there had been an air traffic accident, a plane crash, they would be blamed for it. And Reagan decided he needed to do it anyway because as a matter of principle. And he was genuinely angry about that. And one of the things that's interesting is about that episode is that although they didn't think ahead this way, it turned out to send a strong signal to the Soviet Union. The Kremlin paid attention to this and realized this guy is not just some superficial Hollywood actor. He's really got some spine. He's really a tough guy. And they sat up and took notice of that.
Steve, given our current economic malaise, to coin a phrase, could you talk a bit about the Reagan administration's efforts to turn around the economy of the early 1980s?
Unlike today, Reagan came to office with a very high inflation, but also high unemployment and a stagnant economy. You may remember we called it stagflation, which orthodox economics up to that point thought you couldn't have. So the centerpiece of Reaganomics, as it was called, was always mainly was the lower income tax rates, which were very, very high at the end of the 1970s, up to 70% on investment income, 50% on earned income, so-called earned income. And Reagan decided we needed to cut those rates dramatically because they misallocated capital. A lot of people invested in tax shelters or avoided investing in productive new enterprises. I mean, in the late 70s, corporate startups, venture capital activity was very, very low. All the things that fueled the boom in the Silicon Valley and other aspects of our economy in the 80s and 90s really flow out of changing our tax system so that the cost of capital fell, and so there were more rewards to capital, and that's why you have an explosion in venture capital activity ever since then.
Let's jump back for just a moment. Supply-side economics came into their own in the mid-1970s. That was the period in which then former Governor Reagan was busy with his 2 runs for the White House. Reagan's thinking during that period was covered extensively by a book that came out right around the same time as the first volume of The Age of Reagan. It was called Reagan in His Own Hand, and it was edited by Kiron Skinner. Let's flash back to what she told Brian Lamb of C-SPAN back in 2001.
We look at the period of his right before the presidency, that 5 years when I've watched television programs, specials on Reagan, and said, oh, in the late 70s, he was at a Santa Barbara ranch chopping wood, relaxing. The idea, the notion that he didn't know very much, that he didn't do very much, that he was handled by advisors, now means we've got to look at him differently.
Steve, what's your estimation of how well prepared President Reagan was when he assumed the presidency in 1981? Especially when compared with other presidents.
Yeah, I make the argument that Reagan was the best prepared incoming president of modern times, which strikes people as an amazing idea. I mean, I think even the late Robert Novak wrote that no incoming president had so bizarre a preparation for office than Reagan. And he's reflecting the conventional wisdom that someone who came out of Hollywood is not the conventional route to political power in this country. Most of our presidents are from Ivy League universities or their equivalent. And Reagan's from tiny Eureka College and hadn't been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and hadn't been to endless Aspen Institute seminars and so forth. But in fact, what the record reveals, again, when you look at the files and the documents, is how seriously in the late 70s he was preparing not just to run again, but to govern. Doing extensive briefings on issues. On arms control, for example, in 1979, he had a 2-day briefing in Los Angeles that included, by the way, experts from the Carter administration. He wanted to hear the best case that they could make for the SALT II treaty. Assembling teams of people around him who ultimately would then be appointed to various government agencies. So he was really thinking ahead, not just to a campaign, but to running a government. And I think that was pretty rare. Other campaigns have tried to mimic this, but I think not with the same seriousness that Reagan did it.
Certainly Reagan spent much of the 1970s, not to mention his entire adult life, thinking of how to defeat the Soviet Union. We could probably spend the entire interview discussing this. But finally, once in office, how well did he do, and what surprised you the most about his efforts?
Well, what I think is most surprising about Reagan across the board, but especially on the Cold War, and when you look closely, is how unconventional he was from even a conservative point of view. Something that's not appreciated very well today is that before Reagan, most conservatives, this would include Nixon and Kissinger as moderate conservatives, but even more ideological conservatives, say at National Review and elsewhere, and Commentary magazine, they all thought the Soviet Union was here to stay. That communism was, if not a decent regime, a durable form of totalitarian rule. Reagan understood and had the insight that they were fundamentally weak. Not militarily, of course. That was the big problem. They had the power to destroy the world, but their economy and social system was deeply dysfunctional. And by degrees, the policy crystallized that if we bring serious pressure against the Soviet Union, not only might we break the stalemate in arms control and have real arms reductions, but the regime itself might be forced to change. They didn't go so far as thinking it would collapse, although there were a few people who thought maybe in 20 or 30 years this whole thing might fall apart, or there'll be a new generation of Soviets who will just throw the whole system aside, which is a little bit of what happened. But I think that was a unique insight, and my book includes a lot of commentary from across the political spectrum saying, well, Reagan's crazy. The Soviet Union has deep reserves of stability they can draw upon. There's no reason to think that their system faces any kind of crisis in the next 10 years. And Reagan instinctively understood that that was wrong.
Steve, in the final analysis, was there, as initially promised, a Reagan Revolution? And if so, what was it?
Well, it's somewhat more limited than people, I think, hoped for at the beginning. And I mean, even some of Reagan's own stated aims he didn't fully achieve. I mean, the federal government's grown larger since he left office. He wasn't able to balance the budget, quite the opposite. He later said that that was his single greatest disappointment, was the unbalanced budgets and the rise in debt and so forth. Where he did succeed, I think most importantly, was in lowering marginal tax rates. Even Obama on a bad day doesn't propose raising them to the pre-Reagan rates. Second, he did rationalize large areas of our regulatory activity. He might have wanted to do more and often did. And in certain areas, he extended deregulation, especially in energy markets and some transportation areas. And those have proven pretty enduring. We completely overthrew some of the worst aspects of antitrust regulation and went back 50 years to the New Deal. And those are important and durable changes. They don't have the drama that the Cold War story has, or as I'd like to put it, the domestic policy story of Reagan is harder to tell because he never stood up in front of the Federal Trade Commission and said, "Mr. Regulator, tear down this rule." But he had that attitude, and I think that those changes, although more subtle and harder to track, were significant. So we'll see going forward whether there's enough residue of the Reagan-era sentiment about government to slow up Obama or not.
For those who want to learn more about the book, is there a website they can go to?
I haven't done a website for the book. I probably should. I'm behind the curve on all this. I'll be blogging about the book a lot in various places, on National Review's Corner, where I get to blog, the No Left Turns website, the Ashbrook Center, and maybe I'll get one up and running here soon.
We've been talking with Stephen Hayward, author of the 2-volume set, The Age of Reagan, whose second volume should be in stores right around the time you're watching this. Steve, thanks again for stopping by Silicon Graffiti.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
For Silicon Graffiti, I'm Ed Driscoll.